I want to begin at Matthew chapter 24. The disciples asked Jesus, what will be the signs of the coming and the end of the age? Now, I love walking in the mountains, and it's one of the ways that I distress. When I get the opportunity to go walking in the lakes or in the Scottish Highlands, to me, that's just as close as you can get to the millennial reign. And I can remember the days of walking in mountains before GPS, before we had these fancy devices that told us exactly where we were on the mountain. You understand? And so, you would get your map up with GPS, and you get a little triangle on the map telling you always exactly where you were. You always knew where you were. And it was so easy. Now, before those days, you used a map and a compass. And when you use a map and a compass, it's completely different because it doesn't tell you where you are. You have to know where you are. And so you have to know to set your map to grid north with your compass to magnetic north, which hopefully points you in the right direction for a start. John Lennon said towards the end of his fame, how can I move forwards if I don't know which way I'm facing? So it's a good idea to know which way you're facing for a start. And that's what the map and the compass does. But what happens is you look for waymarks. That's what you do on the map, because there's not a little triangle saying, there you are. And so you look for waymarks, you look for contours, for instance, on the map. Now, contours, when the lines are very, very close together, it means that the topography is incredibly steep. When the lines are further apart, it means that it's flattening out. However, what the waymarks look like on a two-dimensional map are completely different than when you actually arrive at that point and you see them in a three-dimensional reality. Do you understand what I'm saying? What it looks like on a map, the reality of that can be very, very different. I know we have walkers in this congregation this morning that understand this completely. So you look for waymarks, you look for contours, you look for walls, you look for streams, you look for scree. You look for anything that will give you an indication as to where you are. Now, what happens when you're on a mountain, you're ascending and you want to reach the summit, is that very often cloud starts to sweep across the path. And so the visibility is there 1 minute and the next minute it's gone. So you have to kind of figure out the speed that you're walking at. And if you can figure out the speed that you're walking at, you can almost calculate the point when you're going to get to your next waymark. And if you're on the right path, you should reach the waymark that you see on the map. Two things happen when you reach that waymark. First of all, there's a sense of relief that at least you're on the right path. But normally there's also a sense of dread, because you know very often that the mountain is just going to get steeper, the path is going to get harder, and the way is going to get more exposed. So it's a mixed feeling of relief and dread. And I think that's what it is for us with our map. When these things happen, we experience almost a sense of relief that you think, oh, okay, we're on the right road here. This is a birth pang. This is a waymark. But along with that relief, there's a dread. Because as Christians, we know where this thing is going towards. What we don't know is what we see on a two-dimensional map, what the three-dimensional reality of that is actually going to look like. Now, back in 2020, I'd just come out of hospital. I'd had a tumour taken out. And within 3 days of having that tumour taken out, we went into this global lockdown. And nobody really knew how bad it was going to be. Do you remember? Right at the beginning, nobody really knew. I lost a good pastor friend of mine. He was praying for me when I was going into hospital with that tumour. And the Lord showed me that out of the 6 pastors that met together, one of us we were going to go down to 5. I thought that was me. I was convinced it was me because I was having this tumour taken out. Within 2 or 3 weeks of the outbreak of COVID, my pastor friend died. Not in a very nice way. So, COVID was an incredibly confusing time. And I'll talk more about that to come. But I was convinced, and I still am convinced, that it was a waymark on the map. Maybe even a birth pang. Things changed. We'll look at that more as we get. Things changed. And so you go from COVID-19, and as vigilant Christians, you're looking for the next waymark, aren't you? Yeah. What's the next thing, Lord? Well, you're always going to get wars. You're always going to get rumors of wars. You're always going to get earthquakes. They're happening all the time. Right now, there seems to be a peak in those things. But I remember saying to Mandy, if this is a birth pang, according to Matthew 24, then the next big one is global persecution. If this really is a birth pang, then the next really big one is global persecution. I remember saying that. And in Matthew chapter 24, verse 9, it says, then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and betray one another, and so on. And we find ourselves from October the 7th in a situation that made Crystal Nacht look like a teddy bear's picnic. Yeah. There was 90 Jewish people died in Crystal Nacht. I know that what happened after was horrific, but on that night, 90 people died. What happened on October the 7th was exponentially worse and more cruel in any way we could possibly imagine. And that's where we find ourselves on the map. So the two-dimensional, you shall be hated by all nations. We all know it. But what does it look like in reality? And we're just beginning to try to understand that right now, aren't we? So what we're going to look at in this session is, how on earth have we ended up in this place? How have we ended up here? How has the church ended up here? How's the world ended up in this place? So I just want to go back 80 years to the Second World War and just look at the waymarks all the way along that map which have led us to where we are now. And I do believe it will help us to understand where we are headed. So if you want to have a quick look at Ecclesiastes chapter 3, I'm sure you would agree with me, and I'm sure Jacob would agree with me, there's a sense in which the dress rehearsals are coming to a close. You know? That this is getting really serious now. Now in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, Solomon, in all of his wisdom, talks about seasons and times, doesn't he? He says, there is appointed a time for everything. There is a time for everything under heaven. The Byrds in the 1960s wrote a song about this. To everything, turn, turn, turn. You remember? A time to give birth and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. Praise the Lord. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace. A time to shun embracing. A time to search and a time to give up as lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear apart and a time to sew together. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate, a time of war, and a time of peace. Now, does anybody know who the silent generation are? So before the baby boomers, there was a generation called the silent generation. My mum and dad are baby boomers, so I kind of understand that time period. I'm somebody from the Generation X, if you like. And we've all gone through our own kind of mindsets, if you like, cultural battles and so on. And the silent generation effectively was called the silent generation because they lived through very difficult times. They didn't parade down streets with banners and all the kind of stuff that you see today. They lived through very difficult times and they just got their head down and got on with it. Completely different to today. They were born from about 1928 to 1945. Some of them lived through 2 world wars. They really saw what life can throw at you. Now, of course, when Hitler began to invade Europe with the Blitzkrieg thing, and he cut through Europe like a hot knife through butter, there were 350,000 troops completely trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. Allied troops trapped, caged like a bird. And in very many ways, there was no hope. And if Hitler could take those 350,000 troops, it was over, folks. Churchill calculated that if he could get 20 to 30,000 of those troops back, he'd have done okay. And then the King of England did something that you can't imagine today. He called for a national day of prayer. Back then, they could discern what evil looked like. Back then, they could. The King of England could. Churchill could. They knew what evil was, and they knew that Adolf Hitler was evil personified, and his cronies around him, some of them even worse. Today, we have people in government that don't know their left hand from their right. They don't know good from evil anymore. But they did back then. And they queued up to pray. Can you believe that? Can you even imagine that? This is our heritage, friends. This was England, really, at its finest hour, queuing up to go and pray, asking God for mercy at a time when without him, as Jehoshaphat said, we have no power and we don't know what to do. And so they prayed. Churchill expected between 20 and 30,000 troops to return. He thought that he'd do well. 338,000 troops got back. Churchill called it the miracle of Dunkirk. The miracle of Dunkirk. Listen, friends. Our God is a prayer-answering God. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Now, during World War II, 65 million people, roughly 65 million people lost their lives. It was horrific. On the 8th of May, VE Day, you've probably seen the film footage of VE Day and all the celebrations. You can kind of understand it, can't you? The relief. And we move into a season of hope, new hope. Hope! Mortgages eventually were very cheap. Eventually. And people began to have babies. And they called this generation the baby boomers. And it was a massive population of babies being born at that time because for the first time in a long time, there was a reason to live. Baby boomers. Now, the baby boomers in many ways, and I'm sure probably some of you guys would fit into that category of baby boomers, you have seen the best that this life has had to offer, really. And I liken them to almost like a tidal wave out at the sea. This huge booming tidal wave that's moving towards the shores of eternity. All of us are. And the baby boomers have always somehow risen to the top. And this tidal wave has gone from the 1950s to the 1960s to the 1970s you've seen it all, haven't you? The 1980s, the 90s, the noughties, all the way through to now. Now we're living in a time where many of the baby boomers are crashing on the shores of eternity and are going to have to give an account for their life. And I'm sure you've been to many funerals. I have. It makes me so angry when people have "I did it my way" at the funeral. Many baby boomers do that. Unbelievable. So you have seen the best. And I have too. I'm from Generation X, and that wasn't that much different. We grew up with a Judeo-Christian values. We really did. And it was a wonderful place to live. I love living in England. I love the countryside. I love this. I think Britain has a lot to offer. Now, in the early years, of course, in the 1950s, there were rations. Does anybody remember food rations, by the way? Yes, they do. There were food rations. I can remember, my mum, well, particularly my dad, was really tight. I mean, my dad, before the days of double glazing, he had cellophane. Did anybody else have cellophane as secondary glazing? We never got to have canned pop. It was diluted, everything. Oh my goodness, he was so tight with his money. Because that's how it was. And you saved and saved and saved, but they did have it good. And mortgages were very, very cheap. Particularly in America, there was this boom. And you go into the 50s, and of course you've got rations and a massive rebuild. Not so in America, of course. But in Europe, this massive, it looked like a wasteland in places. This massive rebuild. And then we see something happen in 1948 that I'm sure you understand what it is, right? And to think that the sole desire, the ultimate desire of the Nazi Party was, of course, to invade, to occupy, but their ultimate desire was always to destroy God's people. And instead of the destruction of the Jewish people, there was the re-establishment of Israel as a nation. You see, friends, every time, we'll look at this more as we go through this thing, every time the enemy gets near to the point of destroying God's people, the enemy itself is destroyed. That's what happens. Now, it can get very close to midnight and it can get very, very dark, but in the end, it's the enemy himself that gets destroyed. So 1948 was another incredible miracle. How much politics you want to understand, it was a miracle. 1949, there was another miracle. There were two old ladies on the Isle of Lewis that decided enough is enough. We're fed up with this mundane, lukewarm Christianity. And they covenanted with God. And they said, if your word is true, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from the wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, says the Lord. They said, Lord, if that's true, then we're going to do that. We're going to seek your face. And we're holding you to your word that you will pour out water on dry ground. These two old ladies, they challenged the pastors on the island. They said, you've tried raffle tickets, you've tried boot sales, you've tried this. When are you going to try God? That's what they actually said. When are you going to try God? And they began to pray. And the Spirit of God, the Spirit of holiness, it was a revival of holiness, the Isle of Lewis, touched down. And it touched down not only in Lewis, but in all the isles off the Scottish. And I know, because we go up there 2 times a year, as much as we can. And I know, I can tell you, that even on the Isle of Skye and the surrounding islands, the fruit of that revival can still be seen today. It really can. You have shopkeepers on those aisles that are, some of them will say, I shouldn't really be serving you on a Sunday. It's the Lord's Day. It's the Sabbath. There's still fruit. It's incredible. It was a genuine revival. In the 1950s, rock and roll kicked in, didn't it? And it came, of course, from America and eventually landed on the shores of Europe and Great Britain. 12-bar blues, it was a new sound. And boy, did it make you move. I love seeing the old footage of them dancing on the dance floors, you know, doing the whole rock and roll thing. It was like some kind of jungle mating call on the dance floors. When I look at that old footage, that's what it looks like to me, some kind of jungle mating call. No wonder there was a boom in babies. And then, of course, you roll through to the 60s. And I think the 60s can be divided, actually, because there was a difference between 1960 to 65 and 65 to the 70s. In the early 60s, there was pop. There was bands like the Beatles, very innocent songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand, you know? I'm in love with her because I feel fine. You got the Beach Boys, you got the Rolling Stones, you got the Kinks, you got bands like this. You know, my dad would sing, how do you do what you do to me, and all this kind of stuff, Jerry and the Pain, all these things. Very innocent. But something happened from 65 to 70. There was a kind of a paradigm shift in the way people began to think. You got the whole psychedelic thing, and we know because Jacob was saved from it. You got the whole psychedelic free love thing that started to kick in. Eastern religions began to permeate through into the West and become very accepted. You got Maharishi, for instance. Maharishi was a con man. John Lennon wrote a song about him called Sexy Sadie because he used to flirt with the Beatles' wives. He was a con man. But you got these Eastern religions coming in at the time, and you got bands like The Doors. And you got suddenly music changed. So you got sounds like break on through to the other side. What was on the other side? What are they trying to break on through to? And you got the whole hallucinogenic drug thing. Things began to change. You've got bands, of course, like the Velvet Underground. And they started to sing about heroin. Heroin, it's my wife and it's my life. Heroin will be the death of me. Heroin became the god for the Velvet Underground. Things started to change. The Beatles went weird. That's what my mum and dad would say. Oh, we liked them in the early 60s, but they just went a bit weird towards the end. That's what they'd all say. My mum and dad couldn't understand Sgt. Pepper. It's like, what was that all about? You talk to my mum and dad about the album Revolver. Oh, they hated it. They just wanted the early stuff, you know? I want to hold your hand. But things began to change. The Rolling Stones started getting stoned. You've got counterculture, you've got civil rights, civil rights movements, you've got JFK was shot, you've got MLK, Martin Luther King was shot, you've got the Vietnam War, this kind of Vietnam stick it to the man thing, you've got flower power, and you've got the Beatles beginning to sing about a different kind of love. All you need is love. But what was love? They never really defined what love was. It was this all-inclusive love that had no bounds. All you need is love. And from 65 to 70, you had this unstoppable kind of juggernaut of hedonistic pleasure. That's what it was. However, now I need to say this. Although these things were going on, and Jacob will bear witness, and many pastors of that era that got saved at that time will, this is really important. It was contained. There were people that were into this stuff in a very, very big way, and it was big. But it was contained. People saw it on telly, like my mum and dad would be good examples, and they would see, you know, the concerts and so on, the free love, all that kind of stuff, but they didn't necessarily enter into it. So there were those that did in a very big way, but there were also those that didn't. It's really important. Really important. There were those that didn't. It was too much for them. It was too excessive. They wouldn't go that far. But there were those that did. Now the wheels came off, as it always does, because the wages of sin is death, and you start to die. You feel like you're dying on the inside. In my youth, I took a lot of hallucinogenic drugs and all kinds of different drugs just to get some kind of satisfaction out of life. And in the end, your liver aches, your kidneys ache. You start to feel like you're dying. You can't keep on partying like an animal. And the wheels fell off. But something happened, and probably Jacob would be the best one to describe it, because to this day, I don't know what caused it. But there was a revival. At a time, can you imagine the pastors of that era? If you were a pastor in that era, you would think that what was happening was unstoppable. You really would. But something happened. Was it utterly sovereign? Is revival completely sovereign? Is man's hand in it somewhere? I don't understand it. I'm not going to try to. But it happened. And people began to get saved in incredible ways. They gave up on the whole lifestyle. And you know a revival by its fruit. That's how you know a revival. And from that revival, we have pastors today that are still going on. We have evangelists. We have teachers. We have missionaries to this day. We have movements to this day that were born in that revival. You shall know them by their fruit. And there was this incredible revival. When the pill became acceptable, when abortion went through the roof, when marriages were beginning to fail, when divorce became the norm, and this whole hippie movement just failed. It broke down. There was no real love in it. All you need is love. Define what love is, because what we've just filled our boots with has not satisfied us. You see? And so we had this incredible revival. And the baby boomers witnessed it. Some firsthand, some maybe through telly, or even through some of the musicals that came from that era. Some of the songs that came from that era. But they saw something of it. And as the Bible says, therefore, they are without excuse. They are without excuse. They grew up in a Christian era. Now I'm going to look at the next era now. If you want to turn to 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3. Generation X. After the baby boomers, there comes this generation. They call it Generation X. With the baby boomers, there was new hope. With Generation X, there was no hope. None. It all changed. And it all changed because of Nagasaki and Hiroshima and the whole build-up of stockpiling nuclear weapons. It went from new hope to no hope. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with the roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat. And Jacob has spoken on this many times. It's talking about the splitting of the atom. The actual word that's used is to loose things. Nuclear fission, to loose. And the earth and its works will be burnt up. And on it goes. Those that were born in that time lived under this constant fear that a nuclear war could break out at any time. We lived under the Cold War. Now, on the 12th of April 1945, Franklin Roosevelt dies, doesn't he? Harry Truman replaces him. Apparently he's a Christian. He's read his Bible through, I think, 3 times through. Imagine this. You become the president of America, and within 3 months, on your watch, you have to give the yes or no to the dropping of 2 massive nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Within 3 months. That's terrifying. But he did it. And he signed it. Signed it away. Harry Truman decided. He gave the go-ahead. Drop those bombs. And so, on the 6th of August, the little boy, they called it the little boy, Hiroshima, and then 3 days later, because the Japanese mentality is you do not surrender. Nobody, it's just the most shameful thing in the world to surrender. 3 days later, they dropped another one. Oppenheimer, there was a film this year about Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer apparently quoted at that time, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of the worlds." There was a description written by somebody that saw that bomb blast, and this is part of it. It says the temperature near the blast site recorded 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky seemed to explode, birds ignited in midair, asphalt boiled. People over 2 miles away burst into crumbling cinders. Others with raw skin hanging in flaps around their hips leaped, shrieking, into waterways to escape the heat. Men without feet stumbled about on charred stumps. Women without jaws screamed incoherently for help. Bodies described as boiled octopuses littered the destroyed streets. Children's tongues were swollen with thirst, pushed floating corpses aside to soothe their scalded throats with bloody river water. It was absolutely shocking. Hell broke out over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And let's be honest, friends, you don't need me to tell you this, you already know this. We're probably more close to a nuclear war now than we ever have been since that time. And we can't even imagine what it would look like. That was the era of Generation X. I can remember going to I loved going to school. I loved primary school. I loved singing, cross-legged, on the floor. "Oh, Jesus, I have promised to serve thee to the end. Be thou forever near me, my master and my friend. I shall not fear the battle if thou art by my side, nor wander off the pathway if thou wilt be my guide." Remember singing that? And I can't speak for anybody else, all sitting cross-legged. I believed it. I actually believed it. We would sing the Lord's Prayer. I love singing the Lord's Prayer. And then secondary school was a little bit different. I didn't like secondary school. They didn't do the Lord's Prayer. But there was this teacher called Mr. Boot. And Mr. Boot looked like a World War II pilot. And I loved him. You know, there's certain people in life that can walk into a room and change the atmosphere of a room. They carry a presence. That was Mr. Boot. He could walk into a classroom or walk into a hall and the atmosphere would change as he walked. He carried something. And Mr. Boot, who was the deputy head, you had a healthy fear for him. And Mr. Boot used to teach us. We were only 12, 13 years of age. He used to teach us in English lessons. And he recommended that we read a book called Animal Farm. Now, I never read books back then, but I loved Mr. Boot. He inspired me. And I read Animal Farm. I couldn't believe that book. He also recommended another book, 1984. And Mr. Boot told us, back at the beginning of the 80s, he told us, I can remember like it was yesterday, that we would go into a time that is described in the book 1984, in which we would actually live in something that George Orwell described as Big Brother. He said that would happen. Mr. Boot, get this, loved to quote from the Bible. He quoted from the Bible like it was the ultimate authority. This is the early 1980s. His favorite book in the Bible was the book of Revelation. And his favorite chapter was Revelation 13. And he told us what was coming. I loved him. He made me captain of the B team for table tennis. Those were my dizzy heights of success in the secondary school. I love that man. He inspired people. You didn't mess with him. He carried an authority. That was what it was like. For the silent generation, for the baby boomers, and for Generation X, we grew up in a Christian atmosphere. And at the time, we had something called the nuclear arms race that really was mad. Mutually assured destruction. It was mad. And of course, because they couldn't really unleash those things, we ended up with proxy wars, didn't we? Many, so many. Just many more than you would think. And of course, because of the sinful nature of people and their desire for power, thousands and millions of people died in those proxy wars. This was Generation X. In the 20th century, it is estimated that 120 million people died in some war or another. By the end of the Cold War era, or round about today, you have roughly 12,700 nuclear weapons. It's a lot. When you think how big some of these things are. These are not the weapons that we saw over Nagasaki and Hiroshima. These things are insane. At the time in Generation X that I grew up in, when I began to be a rebel, because that's what you do when you're in your teens, you rebel. There were many songs about the Cold War. There was a song called 2 Minute Warning. There was another song called Seconds. There was another song called Seconds by another group. There was a song called Two Tribes. There was a song called Enola Gay. There was a song called 2 Minutes to Midnight. There was a song called Dancing with Tears in My Eyes. But the one for me was by Sting. And it was called Russians. And he says, how can I save my little son from Oppenheimer's deadly toy? And he said it would be such an ignorant thing to do if the Russians loved their children too. That's what we see with Hamas right now. Their hatred for Israel is more than their love for their own children. If the Russians loved their children too. So, that was Generation X. And I've always grown up feeling quite proud to be British, not in a racist way. My wife's Jamaican, not racist. Just because you're proud of living in the country that you live in, it doesn't make you a racist. But it's had a lot going for it. Now I want to move on to the millennials. This is where it all changes, really changes. And it's hard for some of us to comprehend how much it has changed the psyche of people. Have a look at Isaiah chapter 24. Isaiah 24. In Isaiah 24, verse 1. When you read this passage, it seems so divorced from what we consider the millennials, but I actually believe they're going to see this. Behold, the Lord lays the earth waste, he devastates it, he distorts its surface and scatters its inhabitants. And the people will be like the priest, the servant like his master, the maid like a mistress, the buyer like the seller, the lender like the borrower, the creditor like the debtor. The earth will be completely laid waste and completely despoiled, for the Lord has spoken this word. The millennials kind of represent a people that were born from kind of 80s through to the very, very late 90s. They call themselves the enlightened generation. The enlightened generation. The millennials were hit with a kind of a triple whammy. First of all, it's September the 11th, then the 2008 crash, and then, of course, COVID. So a lot went on. People ask things like, who dropped the Twin Towers? It doesn't matter necessarily. It's what is the fruit? What is the fruit from that event? How did it change us? How did the dropping of the Twin Towers change our society? What is the fruit from it? Well, first of all, and we can all remember where we were when those towers went down. I was an alarms engineer at that time. I was working in a security core cash vault, stacked with millions of pounds in hard cash. I was stuck in an airlock. The alarm had gone wrong. I was there to repair the alarm. And I can remember the people in the office, this place was stacked full of money, and I could hear them saying, the World Trade Centers have gone down. The World Trade Centers have gone down. And I went into the office and you could see on the news, what on earth is going on? Everybody can remember where they were. But what was the fruit? Here was the fruit. Islam is a peaceful religion. That was the fruit. The very thing that you would think would not be the fruit was the fruit. At that time, I used to keep a Quran, and I'd underlined all the verses to do with violence. And my little son was at a primary school, and we had a prominent politician came. So after the thing, I went up to her, I said, Anne, can I have a chat with you? She said, of course. So I took her outside of the school, got the Quran out of the car, and went through these verses on violence. I said, Anne, Islam is not a religion of peace. She looked at me, she said, you know that, and I know that, but what can we do? That's what she said. What can we do? The fruit of September 11th is that Islam is a peaceful religion. Inclusivism began to become the thing. We have to be inclusive. Therefore, exclusivism became the danger. And all of a sudden, we begin to get tarred with the same brush as the radicals. That's what happened. And so at that time, Christians that believed in the finality of the Word of God, the authority of the Word of God, began to be seen as a danger to society. So the fruit of September the 11th, I believe, the first thing was the decentralizing of the gospel message. You could see it happening. Suddenly, it wasn't the thing anymore. I grew up with pastors that preached the gospel. But after September the 11th, the gospel's no longer central. It's more and more pushed off to the side. Instead of the Apostle Paul, I am not ashamed of the gospel, is I am ashamed of the gospel. What are we going to do with this hot potato? Where are we going to push it? What we'll do is we'll fill up the annual agenda with so many things that the congregation won't know when they're not preaching the gospel anymore. We'll just get so busy. This was the fruit. This was the fruit. The decentralization of the gospel, and ultimately pastors becoming ashamed. I used to knock around with 6 pastors. We would meet every month, and we would meet for a long time. It wasn't a short time. We'd meet for 3 or 4 hours. We got on really well, but we decided once that we would explore what is the gospel. I kid you not. We went for one another's throats. There was such disagreement on what the gospel was. Because you see, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's very clear that our God exclusively says, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. That's it. That's Old Testament. New Testament says this, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. What do we do with these hot potatoes when inclusivism becomes the thing? Because of September the 11th. We don't let the congregation know. You don't let the congregation know that you're pushing this thing out. You keep the congregation busy. And that's what's happened. That's the fruit.